Hey everybody, Dr. Duncan here. We're starting a new unit looking at rivers and water use. And we'll also be including in this some of the challenges that we're facing with climate change and some of the solutions. The solutions will mostly be covered in Climate Change 7. That'll be assigned to a different day. So let's start now with part 1 of Climate Change 6, which is understanding how rivers work. But before we get there, let's take a look at what's coming down the line over the next couple weeks and what we cover in this class. After we cover water, we're going to cover 2 more topics that are essential to our survival and livelihoods, and that is energy and food. With regard to energy, we're going to look at how our current reliance on fossil fuels is causing so many problems, and how the alternatives in terms of renewable energy is offering some pretty bright and affordable solutions that we need to transition to really quickly. And then finally, in this series, we're going to look at food, both how climate change is threatening our food supply, but also how farmers and agriculturalists everywhere can adapt. And then finally, looking at how our choices about what foods we eat on a daily basis have a big impact on what our individual climate footprint is like. So we'll be looking at all these things when we get to food. All right, back to rivers and how rivers work. The hydrologic cycle is the scientific term for how water moves around on the planet. This involves water in liquid form as it flows through rivers and into lakes and oceans, but also in gas form as it evaporates and moves around. We see that when we look up and see a cloud. When you look up at a cloud, don't think, oh, there's that stuff up there in the sky. Think about that as a big old chunk of water moving across the landscape. That's part of the hydrologic cycle. Rain, of course, is the climate delivering water back to the landscape. Water also percolates down into the ground. We'll be talking about that in a few minutes. So it becomes an important resource for many communities deep below the surface. So water is constantly on the move, and that the whole process of it moving between all these different corners of the earth is known as the hydrologic cycle. Now, another important concept in this is called the watershed. Watershed is an area within which all surface water drains to a common waterway. You see that here, where in this little cartoon illustration it shows how these high ridges that are surrounding this landscape prevent rainwater from flowing outside of this basin. Instead, it all flows downhill into the nearest creek and then into the river and then out into that lake or ocean, whatever that's supposed to represent. In Alabama, most of us live within the same ginormous watershed called the Mobile River Basin. Watersheds can be nested within one another, but when you have a watershed that connects all the way to the coast, that is commonly referred to as a basin. Sometimes you'll have people use the terms interchangeably, basin and watershed. I might do it from time to time, but I try to reserve the term basin, and I want you to reserve the term basin for a collection of watersheds that drain to the coast at a single point. And of course, the Mobile River Basin that you see here illustrated on this map, which covers parts of 4 states, is the one that we've focused a lot on so far because of all the biodiversity that it contains. Now let's zoom in a little bit and look at where we are in Birmingham. I mentioned briefly before that watersheds are nested within one another. So here we're looking at the major watersheds that are part of the Mobile River Basin. And right there in the center, you'll see the Warrior River Basin, more technically known as the Black Warrior River Basin. I don't know why they didn't put Black Warrior on there, but it's the Black Warrior River Basin and the Cahaba Basin. And these are the 2 that the Birmingham metropolitan area spills over and across. We are basically right there where I'm throwing the cursor right now, and the Birmingham metro area covers both of those 2 watersheds. Both are nested and are major watersheds within the greater Mobile River Basin. All right, so when we think about rivers, we think about water, of course, and why wouldn't we? But rivers actually do more than transport water. They also transport a lot of sediment. That's your first fill-in-the-blank option there, and it's illustrated by the cartoon up at the top that's showing some of the ways in which sediments move downstream. Heavier sediments sort of bouncing their way along the bottom. Lighter sediments can float in the water and be moving more quickly. In addition to sediments and water, rivers transport nutrients. So on those sediments and also dissolved into the water are nutrients that are very important for plant growth, such as nitrogen and phosphates. In addition to water and sediments and nutrients, rivers are also moving woody debris. You see that in the middle picture there, which I think is up from Seattle, near Seattle, Washington. What you're looking at there is a lot of trunks of trees that are being transported downstream by this large river. But this can also include like small branches and things like that. This is important because this woody debris, it becomes habitat for species that live in the river. The woody debris, as it's broken down by microbes, releases nutrients into the water, and so forth. So that's any healthy river is going to have a lot of woody debris moving through it. Another thing that rivers move is energy, and the energy is moved in two forms. Some of that energy is stored in the form of organic molecules. Remember, organic means simply that those molecules are derived from living organisms and processes associated with living organisms. So organic molecules all have a carbon at the heart of those molecules. So an example would be that when a leaf falls into the river and it's broken down by microbes, and the molecular components of that leaf are released into the water and drift down. Well, those molecular components, those large complex molecules, still have energy tied up in them, and other microbes can break down those molecules, and when they tear those molecules apart, it releases that energy, and that's how those microbes get their energy. So all this to say that rivers are transporting a lot of organic energy stored in the form of organic molecules. In addition to energy stored in that way, rivers also store energy as potential energy. Potential energy is basically the physics term for stored energy. I want you to imagine that you have like a heavy weight, and you pick up that weight and you put it on top of a shelf. All right, you have now added energy to that weight. It is above the ground, and the energy that it has can be released if something were to tip that weight or push it off the shelf and it were to fall to the floor. When it falls to the floor, that becomes kinetic energy, the energy of movement. But while that weight is sitting up on top of a shelf, it's known as potential energy. Now, what the hairy heck does this have to do with rivers? Well, rivers flow from higher elevations to lower elevations. When water is at a higher elevation, it has a lot more potential energy than it has when it's at a lower elevation. And of course, if it's at sea level, it has no more potential energy at all. That potential energy turns out to be very important for a variety of biological processes, but it's also important for economic reasons, because we use that potential energy to generate some of the electricity that we use here in the U.S. and other places in the world. Okay, so you got those two forms of energy that rivers are transporting, as well as woody debris, nutrients, sediments, and water. Healthy rivers have a good balance of these functions. Not too much, not too little. The Goldilocks zone is just right for our rivers. Okay, another reason why rivers are very important, of course, and this is why it ties in directly to the topic for this course that you're taking, is that they sustain a lot of biodiversity, especially here in the Southeast. From day one in this class, I've been talking about how Alabama and the Southeast more generally is a global hotspot for aquatic biodiversity. That's principally the species that are living in our rivers and streams. And of course, I hope you remember that Alabama and the region is a global hotspot for freshwater snails, freshwater mussels, freshwater crayfish, freshwater fishes, and of course, what else? But freshwater turtles. That's right. So we can claim to be pretty awesome for all 5 of those categories in terms of aquatic biodiversity. That's here in Alabama and throughout the Southeast, but especially Alabama. All right, that concludes the first portion of Climate Change 6 the unit Climate Change 6. We're going to pick up next on the different ways that humans use rivers and how we're using rivers here in the Southeast.